Hi, everyone. My name is Yvette Bunsell. I'm here with author Richard Forer. We're here to discuss Sam Harris's October 12th podcast, The Sin of Moral Equivalence. Sam Harris is a best-selling author, philosopher, and neuroscientist, and he argues in his podcast and article that there's no moral equivalence between Israel and Palestinians. We're going to deconstruct that argument a little bit. However, before we begin, I'll introduce myself. My name, again, is Yvette. I'm a Palestinian, although I was born in Jordan. My grandmother on my mother's side was a refugee during the Nakba. She had a home in Jaffa, and they had to flee to Jordan when she was 8 years old. She recalls a story that's very painful for her, where she was in a car looking backwards and saw the family directly behind her get blown up as they were fleeing toward the Jordanian border. My father's side still lives in Abud. It's a village outside of Ramallah. That's where he was born. The village has Israeli settlements that grow year by year. The last 14 days, they've been under lockdown, warned not to go in main streets. Settlers will shoot them if they think that they're doing anything in the main street that may look suspicious or oftentimes maybe for no reason. I moved to the United States when I was 9 years old. I didn't speak much English, assimilated very well. None of this is meant to be un-American. So I definitely want to mention that. Despite my history, my family's history on both sides, my father always told me growing up, and I think this is a really important point considering what's been going on since 9/11 and the rhetoric surrounding Islam and the Arab populations. He told me always, we do not hate Jewish people. He was very, very clear about that. He said, we do not like extreme Zionist policy or extremism in any kind, but Jewish people are good people. He taught me not to hate, and I'm so grateful for that. So as you watch Western media, just be cautious of the rhetoric surrounding Arabs. Most of them are good people, and just like everyone else, they live the same way as everybody else. They have the same dreams. So we must be cautious and not villainize a whole group of people. So with that, I will ask Richard Forer. He's the author of 2 books. His latest book is Wake Up and Reclaim Your Humanity, Essays on the Tragedy of Israel and Palestine. And he also had a book that he wrote around 10 years ago, which is when I met him and he signed it for me and we became friends. It's Breakthrough, Transforming Fear into Compassion, a New Perspective on the Israeli-Palestine Conflict. They are fascinating books and very well researched, so I recommend you can look into them after this interview if you're so inclined. So Rich, before we discuss specific points that Sam Harris makes, you can tell us a little bit more about you if you'd like, and also give us your overall assessment of the tone of the article.
Yeah, let me start with the tone of the article. And actually, I want to kind of address this directly to Sam. I don't know if he'll ever get to see our interview, but hopefully he will. Sam, the arguments you make in your podcast and article remind me of me before I let go of my presumed limited and mortal identity as a Jew and recognize my common humanity with all people, before I realized that in truth, I was as much Muslim or Christian as Jew, as much Palestinian or Israeli as American. In your article, you repeat virtually the identical arguments I once made and that many of my Jewish friends and relatives still make, despite the fact that none of us ever researched the subject. The idea of researching the subject never even crossed our minds. And given that I heard some of the same arguments you're making now, 9 years ago, I'm sure it never crossed your mind. Instead, we made up the history because it seems so obviously the case, because it fits so neatly into our internal logic that is shared by individuals and groups with similar worldviews. We thought we were defending the history and the integrity of our people, but what we were really doing was defending our self-imagery, our identities from anything that might threaten them. The Jewish state was a part of our identities. Thus, accusations that threatened our idealistic images of Israel threatened our idealistic images of ourselves. Therefore, being right was more important to us than peace. Being right clouded our judgment. And because our arguments were founded upon the need to be right, they were prejudices, and they were and still are Israeli talking points. By replacing documented accounts with personal prejudice and giving moral support to Israel's policies and constant violations of international law, collectively, we've all made it possible for Israel to shun peace and maintain its occupation. Now, Sam, I'm not terribly familiar with your writings and podcasts, but a close friend of mine who has followed you regularly for many years and whose opinions I value greatly tells me you are generally careful with your facts and devoted to clear thinking. He wanted me to know that you might be able to listen to and consider what I will be saying in this interview. Now, I only have time to respond to a few of your arguments, but as my research using mostly Israeli government sources has proven, every one of your arguments is a gross distortion of the facts. Before I awakened, my insistence on believing what I wanted to believe while refusing to research the subject qualified me for the category that you call in your article, quote, the legions of the confused, end of quote. My books address every argument you make in the sin of moral equivalence, though I won't address all of them today. If people want to protect against bias, most of us would want to learn about the history of Israel-Palestine. Rather than using Israeli or Palestinian sources, most of us would prefer to use more neutral sources, such as human rights organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, or B'Tselem, the Israeli NGO. So, Yvette, why don't we continue with some of Sam's comments?
So Sam, in the beginning of his podcast and article, said Gaza hasn't been occupied since 2005. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, that's really something. What Sam is referring to is Israel's unilateral withdrawal of the Jewish settlements that were in Gaza until 2005. Well, first of all, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon understood that according to international law, an occupying power is responsible for the health and hygiene of its subjects. Removing the 8,000 settlers, as well as Israel's military presence from Gaza, gave the Israeli government the argument that it was no longer subject to that internationally legal responsibility. Sharon also said that the removal of the settlements was, quote, a fatal blow. There's no Palestinian state in a unilateral move, end of quote. To Sharon's team, the withdrawal of the settlers marked the end of negotiations over Jerusalem, borders, and refugees, thereby preventing any chance for a peace treaty. Additionally, while the gullible US government was fixated on the withdrawal, Israel placed 12,000 new settlers in illegal settlements in the West Bank. In 2007, Israel established a blockade of Gaza that is still in effect and that Israel itself admits is, quote, a form of economic warfare, end of quote. Israeli officials say they intend, and they've been saying this for years, that they intend to keep the Gazan economy on the brink of collapse without quite pushing it over the edge, functioning at the lowest level possible, consistent with avoiding a humanitarian crisis. The blockade controls the entry of medical equipment and supplies, construction material, the amount of food delivered to Gaza, which is only enough, as Sharon's chief advisor said, to prevent the Palestinians from starving. The blockade limits and has almost destroyed the fishing industry. The buffer zones that Israel has established reduce the amount of Gaza's farmland by as much as 35%. And the blockade prevents all but a tiny number of Palestinians from entering or exiting Gaza, even when they need life-saving medical care. When I was in Gaza in 2012, I met a man at the Rafah refugee camp who told me, and this was a very nice man, he was about your age, Yvette, He told me that his mother and his 2-year-old daughter had both died because Israel rejected their applications for life-saving medical care that was not available in Gaza because of Israel's blockade. His family submitted applications for each of them to leave Gaza for treatment in Egypt or the West Bank, and both applications were denied without explanation. The child and his mother died. I want to tell you one other story about what I saw in Gaza. I was there for about a week in November 2012 as a member of a human rights delegation. On November 8th, while we were there, random Israeli machine gun fire erupted in the village of Abasan Kabira in the southern Gaza Strip, fatally wounding 13-year-old Hamid Abu Daka as he was playing soccer on the narrow dirt road in front of his house. The next day, my delegation attended the boy's funeral. Afterwards, Hamid's playmates took us to the spot where he was shot. With wounds to his chest, Hamid had stumbled to the front door of his house before collapsing. By the time paramedics showed up, he was comatose. He died before the ambulance reached the hospital. Abasan Kabira is 1.5 kilometers from the Israeli border and near a buffer zone. In conversations with residents, I learned that Israeli tanks, drones, and helicopters enter Gaza as often as 6 days a week. Once inside the border, they fire in all directions to scare away anyone in the area. After saying goodbye to Hamid's friends and Hamid's brother, my fellow delegates and I began walking back to our bus, where a group of villagers was waiting to speak with us. With my Gazan friend Khalil translating, a middle-aged woman asked me, "Do you sleep with your shoes on?" I realized this was a rhetorical question, so I replied by asking if she slept with her shoes on. She explained that Israel's incursions into Gaza are so terrifying that many residents sleep with their shoes on so they can jump out of bed at a moment's notice and run to safer areas. During the next couple of days, the residents I spoke with throughout the Gaza Strip confirmed this phenomenon everywhere I spoke. I hope that answers the question about Gaza for Sam.
Thank you, Rich. I mean, I think that we're all hurting right now, so we're holding back our tears the best we could. So to move on to the next question that I have. Sam says there are people and cultures that rejoice over the massacre of innocent civilians. Conversely, there are people and cultures that seek to avoid killing innocent civilians, that occasionally prosecute and imprison their own soldiers. He wasn't very specific, but we all know what he's talking about. Is this accurate?
Well, it's certainly not accurate if he wants to apply it to Israel. On October 7th, Israeli President Isaac Herzog said what many Israeli politicians have said and generals have also said for many years: there are no civilians in Gaza. End of quote. Now, for the past week, more than a week, Israel has been bombing the Gaza Strip with little to no differentiation between civilian or military targets. It has destroyed schools, hospitals, more than 130 health facilities, churches, mosques, and whole city blocks. It has killed over 4,000 people, including 1,200 children, injured more than 14,000, displaced more than 1 million, and cut off food, water, electricity, fuel, and medical supplies. Those who Israel doesn't kill with its bombs may die from starvation, dehydration, or lack of medicine. If they are not blown to bits first, infants in incubators will die. Gazans able to communicate with the outside world are saying there's no safe space in the Gaza Strip. People are dying everywhere. On the surface, Israel is avenging the October 7th attack by Hamas. But at a deeper level, I claim that Israelis are exasperated that a majority of Palestinians refuse to collaborate in their own dispossession. Therefore, they must pay for their insolence. Israelis' imperiousness, heartlessness, and lack of self-reflection protects them from becoming conscious of the horrors they have inflicted and are inflicting on Palestinians for the crime of not being Jewish. Israel has become the monster it fears, and as it always does, it will deny culpability for its malice. No Israeli will be indicted for war crimes, Sam, and the Israeli government will not prosecute or imprison even its most bloodthirsty killers, who happen to be its leaders. In 2015, I'm going to give you an example. Settlers spray painted the Star of David and the words "Vengeance" and "Long Live the Messiah" on the outer walls of the Duwabsha family home in the West Bank village of Duma. They then firebombed the house. 18-month-old Ali was burned alive. His parents, Saad and Riham, died a few weeks later. With burns covering 80% of his body, Ali's 4-year-old brother Ahmad was the lone survivor. The murders drew international condemnation, and because it couldn't afford to be seen as condoning such barbarity, Israel charged 2 settlers with the crime. A few months later, at a Jewish wedding reception, dozens were filmed dancing around a photo of the deceased 18-month-old Ali. They were celebrating his death and praying for more revenge on Palestinians. Revenge for what? For living there on God's land? At a preliminary court hearing for one of the firebombers, protesters taunted Ali's grandfather, Hussein Duwabsha, with chants of, quote, "Where is Ali? There is no Ali. Ali burned. Ali is on the grill," end of quote. And, "Where is Ali? Where is Riham? Where is Saad? It's too bad Ahmad didn't burn as well," end of quote. That kind of behavior is not uncommon in Israel. In 2010, on a visit to the West Bank, I met a man from the village of Nilim. He'd been a farmer, but Israel had seized 85% of his and his village's land for new Jewish-only settlements, so he became an elementary school teacher. He told me about a student he'd had a couple years earlier named Ahmed Musa. During a demonstration on July 29, 2008, Ahmed was alone in an olive grove when an Israeli border police officer shot him in the head. In 2010, an Israeli court indicted the boy's murderer for negligent manslaughter, but the officer was acquitted but convicted for the negligent use of arms. I heard, though I cannot substantiate, but it's common, this kind of sentence that he is common. The border officer was sentenced to 1 week of house arrest. Speaking of cultures and innocence, since 1967, Sam, Israel has arrested over 50,000 Palestinian children. The most common justification for the arrest is stone throwing. The United States State Department wrote, quote, 90% of Palestinian children arrested by the IDF during the year were hand-tied, 84% blindfolded, 58% subjected to physical abuse, and 91% denied access to a lawyer prior to questioning, end of quote. Human Rights Watch, quote, Palestinian children are treated in ways that would terrify and traumatize an adult, end of quote. Defense for Children International Palestine estimates that law enforcement uses physical violence on 73% of children after arrest. In the majority of cases, neither the children nor their parents know why they're arrested or where they are being taken. Once arrested, soldiers blindfold and handcuff them, make them sit or lie down on the floor of the transport vehicle, and beat them. On the way to interrogation centers, they leave children in the rain, cold weather, or hot sun for hours without food, water, or access to toilets. At the centers, where no lawyers are present, soldiers threaten them with sexual harassment, beatings, and longer sentences. They tell the children they will demolish their houses and arrest their parents, and they first force every child to sign an Arabic language document they do not allow them to read that says they have informed them of their rights. Regardless of guilt or innocence, interrogators intimidate and manipulate kids into signing confessions. This is standard Israeli procedure, so standard that not one of 1,000 complaints filed against Israeli officers since 2001 has led to a criminal investigation. So I guess I could say, in answer to your statement, Sam, that Israel, if there's a country that seeks to avoid killing innocent civilians and that also prosecutes and imprisons their own soldiers for violations of the law, Israel is not it.
Thank you, Rich.
You're welcome.
We got a few questions left, just a couple. Sam says, and I think we see this in the media often, that Palestinians use their own women and children as human shields. In your research, what have you discovered?
Well, first of all, there's very little evidence that Palestinians use their own civilians as human shields. Of course, as one would expect in war, there are cases where it happens, but I can't find any definitive evidence that it is even an occasional practice among Palestinians. But I want to talk about Israeli use of Palestinians as shields. In 2013, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child expressed its, quote, deep concern about the continuous use of Palestinian children as human shields and informants, and about the failure of the state party. They were referring to a lawsuit about the failure of the state party to comply with the ruling of the High Court of Justice that ruled the use of human shields to be illegal. End of quote. B'Tselem found, the main Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem found that since the beginning of the occupation in 1967, Israeli security forces have repeatedly used Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza as human shields, ordering them to perform tasks that risk their lives, such as removing suspicious objects from roads and standing in front of soldiers while the latter shoot from behind them. Human Rights Watch documented that, quote, the IDF, Israel Defense Forces, routinely coerced civilians to perform life-endangering acts that assisted military operations. Friends, neighbors, and relatives of wanted Palestinians were taken at gunpoint to knock on doors, open strange packages, and search houses in which the IDF suspected armed Palestinians were present. So I think that refutes whatever Sam was trying to say about human shields. But again, Sam's comment is so typical. I used to make it, and we just made it up because we just assumed that Israel would never act illegally or unethically, but we were wrong.
Rich, I want to get to the next question, but I don't think you fully told the viewers your background and how you came to be a supporter of the Palestinian cause.
Oh, okay. Well, my book gives a very good, both of my books give a good story explanation about that. Again, like I alluded to, I believe during the first question, up until 2006, I was a staunch defender of Israel. I was a member of AIPAC, the American Israel Political Affairs Committee, which is very right wing. Basically, they're a proxy in the United States for the Israeli government. They lobby Congress. I never criticized Israel. If anyone did criticize Israel, I assumed they were either an anti-Semite or highly misguided. If they claimed that Israel was killing Palestinian civilians, I would say, no, they're not. They're not responsible because the Palestinian civilians they're killing, including children, Hamas and other terrorist groups have taken are embedding themselves within the population, and it's Hamas's fault. It's the terrorist group's fault that the kids are being sacrificed. So I was very, you could say I was willfully blind to any violations of the law, of illegal law, to any human rights abuses that Israel was committing. And then what happened was the second Lebanon war started in July 2006. I won't get into the details of that, but I was very upset, and I saw that in Israel's invasion of Lebanon is necessary. But I also saw the fact that Israel was once again fighting for its life as confirmation that the Arab world was basically psychotic and would not rest until Israel was wiped from the face of the earth. And then what happened was during the 3-week Second Lebanon War, I had a couple arguments with some close non-Jewish friends of mine who I thought would understand, finally, that Israel was merely only defending itself against countries that were really terrorist in nature. And my friends, who I knew had been critical of Israel, when I approached them and told them about, that I thought that the Arab world was psychotic, they they didn't they just didn't agree with me, and that demoralized me. And I went back home thinking, maybe only Jews can understand the suffering of our people. But anyway, then what happened was I got a phone call from an old Jewish friend from New Jersey. I was living in New Mexico at the time. And he told me he was coming to visit. And at that point, I said, fine, that's great. And then I launched into a 2-hour diatribe against the Arab world. And he was a very low key person, my friend Sam. He's very low key. And he just listened to me and he barely interrupted. But I knew while I was talking, I knew that he knew much more than I did about the Israel Palestine problem because he had studied it for years. When I was done with my diatribe, though, he just said, why don't you read a couple books by these two Israeli professors, Baruch Kimmerling and Tanya Reinhardt? So I thought to myself when he said that, oh, you know what? I've never really studied anything. Maybe there's something I don't know that I could learn. So when we hung up the phone, I went on to Amazon and looked up books by Jewish authors only. I wasn't going to read a book by a goy, a Gentile. And I compiled a list of these books and went to my local library, and I found one book by one author, Baruch Kimmerling, who was one of the authors Sam had mentioned to me. And I found a book by Norman Finkelstein called Beyond Chutzpah on the, I think it was called on the well, I forget what the subtitle was. The main title was Beyond Chutzpah. And I was looking at the book jacket and it mentioned my two Jewish heroes, Alan Dershowitz, and it mentioned that the book was debunking Alan Dershowitz's book that had previously been published called The Case for Israel. And then it mentioned Joan Peters, who was a journalist, non-Jewish, who had written the one book I had ever read on the history of Israel-Palestine, which was called From Time Immemorial. And in her book, Joan Peters gave great, great evidence for me to justify my certainty that Israel was just an innocent party living amongst a sea of anti-Semites. But what Finkelstein did in his book, Beyond Chutzpah, and what I found out later other scholars did, including Israeli Zionist scholars, was they completely debunked her book. Some scholars called it complete trash. She had misunderstood a lot of the demographics she had studied. Anyway, that gave me pause. And I said to myself, I can't just leave this book in the library after he's already, after the book jacket told me name two of my heroes. I'm going to have to read about this. Otherwise, I always have a sense of doubt. So I took the book home with me. And then I started reading it the next day. And I won't go into the details. But what happened was the book brought me to a point of shock at what Israel was doing in the name of the Jewish people, anger at myself for being so stupid all my life that I had simply taken everything for granted, embarrassment at my stupidity, and then finally sorrow for the cries of the Palestinian people. And then what happened was, I won't go into any more detail, I had what people would call a spontaneous spiritual awakening. And in that awakening, I could no longer find my identity as a Jew. And what arose was my identity as non-separate from everyone else. I recognized that I was as much Palestinian as Israeli, as much Muslim or Christian as Jew. And in that moment, I instantly knew that I had been wrong all along and that I had simply been interpreting history only in a way that fit my ego, my identity, my self-imagery of myself. And I had so many insights that I realized I had to share what had happened to me with everybody else, because maybe I could make a difference. So that's kind of my story. I hope I didn't go on too long, but that's about it, Yvette. People can
Very,
read in much greater detail in my book.
yeah, it's a very inspiring story, and it really teaches me, and I hope the
Thank
listeners,
you.
that at the very least, the search for truth will set you free.
Right.
And I love that, and it's a wonderful story. So the next question, Sam says, there's a difference between collateral damage and the intentional massacre of civilians for the purpose of maximizing horror. And he also says, in the West, we have advanced to a point where killing of non-combatants, however unavoidable, it becomes, once it starts, it's always inadvertent and unwanted and regrettable, meaning any civilian life lost is inadvertent and unwanted and regrettable. Is Sam's analysis accurate?
No, it's completely wrong. I want to mention, first of all, that when I did my research, I focused primarily on Israeli government sources. I wanted to be as impeccable as possible because I knew what I was up against. I was up against people who were still like I was, and I wanted to penetrate their rigid belief systems. So my main sources came basically from Israeli state archives, Central Zionist archives, the writings of Israel's prime ministers, the Israeli ministries of defense, internal security, and foreign affairs, and most, not only, but significantly Israeli sources, as well as reputable human rights organizations. So Sam mentions that basically he's saying that that the West doesn't maximize horror. Well, that's not the case. Israel has been maximizing horror since its beginning. For example, David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, supported General Yigal Allon's plans during the 1948 war. General Yigal Allon was the most important general in the 1948 war, which Israel calls its War of Independence. And what Allon said, which David Ben-Gurion quotes from his diary, is, "There is a need now for strong and brutal reaction. If we accuse a family, we need to harm them without mercy, women and children included. During the operation, there is no need to distinguish between guilty and not guilty." Well, end of quote. Well, guess what? That's what Israel has been doing, is doing now in Gaza, and has been doing in Gaza for decades. If you look at every one of Israel's invasions, that's what they do, without mercy. Now, moreover, does Sam think, or does anyone think, that a nation whose leaders refer to Palestinians as cockroaches, snakes, psychopaths, serial killers, human animals, not entitled to live, does anyone think that those leaders would inadvertently kill Palestinians or feel regret at killing them? Of course not. That is the language leaders use to seduce their citizens into dehumanizing Palestinians, which makes it very easy to kill them because they're no longer human. And in return, those killers forfeit their own humanity. Ze'ev Schiff was Israel's most respected military analyst by all sides of the military spectrum. He said, quote, "The Israeli army has always struck civilian populations, purposely and consciously. The army has never distinguished civilian from military targets, but purposely attacked civilian targets," end of quote. Aryeh Itzhaki was director of the Israel Defense Forces archives in the 1960s. Speaking about non-combatants, he said, quote, "It is now possible to face up to the ocean of lies in which we were brought up. In almost every town conquered in the War of Independence, acts were committed that are defined as war crimes, such as blind killings, massacres, and even rapes," end of quote. Itzhaki's definition of a massacre is, quote, "the deliberate killing of between 50 and 250 victims in a single episode, whether these are civilians, including old people, women, and children, often by blowing up houses with the occupants locked inside," a specialty of Ariel Sharon, by the way. I just added that back to Yitzhaki, "or civilians and Palestinian soldiers who had been taken prisoner and were killed with a bullet to the back of the head before being thrown into a common ditch," end of quote. Now, let me give you an example. On Shabbos day, December 27, 2008, at 11:30 a.m., Israel launched Operation Cast Lead with an air attack on the Gaza Strip, hitting residential neighborhoods and shopping areas that are very crowded that time of day, and killing 227 people. The Israeli Air Force bragged that 80% of its bombs were precision guided, with 99% hitting their targets: hospitals, schools, neighborhoods, mosques, and of course, shopping areas. 2 weeks later, On another Shabbos day, Israel blocked desperately needed humanitarian supplies from entering Gaza. Its excuse was that it didn't want to violate the Sabbath. So what we see here is that Israel is willing to violate the Sabbath when they can kill people, but when they can help people, they're not willing to violate the Sabbath. The United Nations fact-finding mission on the Gaza conflict, otherwise known as the Goldstone Report, named after South African lifetime Zionist Judge Richard Goldstone, said cast lead was, quote, a deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize a civilian population, end of quote. Human Rights Watch documented attacks that killed and wounded scores of civilians, quote, at or near 3 well-marked schools where Israel knew hundreds of people were taking shelter, end of quote. The International Organization for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination said Israel made no effort to allow civilians to escape the fighting, end of quote. I'm listing all these because there were just about every human rights organization you can think of studied this subject, and they all came out with very similar conclusions. Amnesty International, quote, Israeli forces repeatedly targeted ambulances and medical crews, killing medical workers while they were attempting to rescue the wounded and recover the dead. Injured civilians who could have been saved died needlessly, as Israeli forces frequently denied access to ambulances. Speaking of cultures that treat people decently, Breaking the Silence, an association of Israeli soldiers who served in occupied territory, quoted soldiers who said their, quote, instructions in Gaza were to shoot right away. Any person you run into, shoot to kill, end of quote. An IDF sergeant said the rules of engagement were, quote, anything inside Gaza is a threat. The area has to be sterilized. That sounds like Nazi ideology to me. Has to be sterilized, empty of people. Another soldier said, people that look at you from the window of a house, to put it mildly, won't look anymore. And then another soldier said, if you shoot someone in Gaza, it's cool, no big deal. Now, those soldiers are not describing anything the Israeli government considers, to use Sam's words, inadvertent, unwanted, or regrettable. I myself used to say that Israeli soldiers only killed in self-defense, and that most Jews, including me, of course, mourn the regrettable deaths of the innocent. The fact is that the death of a single Israeli stimulated greater distress than the deaths of hundreds of Palestinians, even Palestinian children. My so-called regret for the deaths of Palestinian civilians was insincere and nothing more than a psychological defense strategy to reinforce self-images of myself as humane. I didn't give a damn if a Palestinian was killed by Israelis, and neither did any other supporter of Israel that I knew. Now, I want to ask Sam the question, is Israel trustworthy when it comes to making agreements with the Palestinians? Well, in 2009, professors from the University of Tel Aviv, Harvard, and MIT answered that question. They published a study on ceasefires between the two sides. Here's what they concluded, quote, it is overwhelmingly Israel that kills first after a pause in the conflict. 79% of all conflict pauses were interrupted when Israel killed a Palestinian, while only 8% were interrupted by Palestinian attacks. The remaining 13% were interrupted by both sides on the same day. Indeed, of the 25 periods of nonviolence lasting longer than a week, Israel unilaterally interrupted 24, and it unilaterally interrupted 100% of the 14 periods of nonviolence lasting longer than 9 days. So, Sam, please, and anyone who shares Sam's views, or even similar views, maybe not as stark, I urge you to listen to the cries of the Palestinian people, to take a moment to admit to yourself that your views inhibit you from uncovering the truth. And Sam, especially being a philosopher and spiritual seeker, why not commit to inquiring into your beliefs and images for the purpose of finding the truth, no matter how painful it may at first appear to be? If you do that, you will learn just how much your enemy images of the Palestinian people are the product of your conditioning. And you will simultaneously be relieved of those images and reclaim your common humanity with all people. Existential fear and confusion will be transformed into compassion and clarity. I can tell you that the greatest relief I ever experienced in my life was when I realized that by clinging to a presumed limited and mortal identity, I had forfeited my humanity. In that moment, the veil of illusion fell from my eyes, and my common humanity with all people was revealed, self-evidently so. There's more I can say that, but for now, why don't we just continue?
No, that was really powerful. I think you unpacked a lot there and you really addressed a lot of things factually and some of the root causes for.
Good. Thank you.
So Sam doesn't mention this, but I'm curious. Can you share what you think about Joe Biden's response to the Hamas October 7th attack?
Well, Biden has a reputation for for empathizing with people who've experienced tragedy. And I think he relishes that reputation. In fact, it's a part of his self-imagery. Empathizing with the Israeli people and with Netanyahu, who is very good at playing to people's personality traits, folks recently, when Biden was in Israel, that empathizing focused Biden's attention on the self-image he has as very empathetic. But it seduced him into giving Israel the green light to do exponentially greater harm to the people of Gaza than Gaza did, than Hamas did to the people of Israel. But the reason I like talking, the reason I feel a need to talk about this is because Biden, with his positive image of being empathetic, still is an example of how a person's self-imagery, benign as it may at first appear, can hijack their humanity and induce them into being complicit in the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Were Biden more conscious and less easily manipulated, he could have said to Netanyahu, enough, wake up, stop holding the world hostage to yours and your country's irrational existential fear, narcissism, and greed. Stop treating these people the way your people were once treated. Give them the same rights that you've killed for. Make peace, return land, let them live like human beings, and stop antagonizing them. And to Sam, I want to say, like me once, I'll bet you think Israel has always wanted to make peace, but was always confronted with Palestinian intransigence. Well, that's just not true. It's not true at Camp David in 2000, and it's not true anywhere. I don't have the time to discuss this issue, but my book covers all of the major peace negotiations. So to listeners, to Sam, to Joe Biden, I want to say, because I was willing to inquire into a lifetime of cherished beliefs, I discovered two universal principles. The first of these principles is that the root cause of this tragedy and of suffering in general is the attachment to a presumed limited and mortal identity and to the beliefs and images that emanate from and reinforce that presumption. And two, the real and constant enemy is not someone or something outside of us. The real enemy is the unexamined mind that unconsciously projects its suffering onto the other and then blames and scapegoats the other for its suffering. If we want to live in peace, if we want our children and grandchildren to live in peace, then peace has to be more important than being right. And that means we must relinquish our enemy images by inquiring within and discovering what is always already the case, which is our common humanity. It's time to wake up and reclaim our common humanity with all people. Thank you for right now. Unless you have
Thanks.
other questions.
I'd love to see another copy of your book, your most recent book, so that people can go out and get it. Wake up and reclaim your humanity. I don't think that there's a better title for what we're going through right now in Palestine and Israel as a people. And I truly believe you not only love all human beings, and not only do you love Palestinians, but you love your Jewish people, Rich. And you love them so much that you want to free them. And that's why you're doing what you're doing. And you said everything so well. You said things so well that I have nothing more to add, except you are my absolute hero. And I hope that this resonates with people and, that we let go of hate and we do wake up and we do regain our humanity. so that there's better days ahead and not scarier days ahead. You know, we do this for everyone. So again, thank you so much. Your love and compassion and turning your knowledge into something you can share with the world. It's not something that everyone can do, but thank you for doing it.
You're welcome. Can I say one more thing?
You can, yes.
I just want to mention, because a lot of people are going to think, oh, well, you know, he's criticizing Israel. I'm not anti-Israeli. I'm not pro-Palestinian. I'm anti-oppression and pro-humanity. I would be doing the same exact thing I'm doing now if the roles of Palestinians and Israelis were reversed. We need to change the language around this. Just because a Palestinian resists occupation, he or she is not a terrorist. And when an Israeli soldier goes in and kills children or terrorizes the civilian population, what can you call them? They're not just soldiers, they are terrorists. And so are the settlers, who are the de facto vigilante squad for the government of Israel, helping to ethnically cleanse the West Bank.
Thank you.
Thank you.